The sign in the dealership window said it plain as daylight, 0% financing for 24 months. Dale Kruger read it standing in the gravel lot off Highway 14, diesel smell in the air, a row of green and yellow machines sitting behind him like a fence. It was March 1983. He was 41 years old, behind on 2 seasons of repair bills, and he hadn't slept well in 3 weeks. That sign looked like an answer. It wasn't free. He just didn't know that yet. The salesman's name was Phil Etten, not a villain, not a schemer. A man who'd been selling farm equipment in Iroquois County for 16 years and who genuinely believed the 465. Oh, sitting on that lot was the right machine for a corn and soybean operation like Dale's. Phil shook his hand with both palms, offered bad coffee, and walked him to the tractor like a man showing you something beautiful. 24 months, zero interest. You pay nothing extra for 2 years. After that, it adjusts to prime plus 2.5. Dale nodded like he'd understood the back half of that sentence. He hadn't. His old machine was a 1971 John Deere 4020, paid off, bought secondhand, rebuilt twice. But that winter it had eaten a hydraulic pump, a crankshaft seal, and 3 hours of a machinist's time on a cracked head. Repair bills for the previous 18 months came to just over $4,000. His neighbor Bud Stasek had picked up a new cab tractor the previous spring and never stopped talking about it. Heated cab, improved fuel economy, electronic diagnostics. Dale's wife Sandra had said twice and carefully that maybe it was time. In 1983, a lot of farmers were hearing that. The equipment price was $47,500. Phil offered a trade-in on the 4020 at $6,200. Dale thought that was low. He'd seen similar models sell at auction for $8,000. But Phil said the market was soft and the 4020 needed work that would come off the top. Dale didn't push back hard enough. He put $5,000 down in cash from a grain check he'd been sitting on. That left $36,300 financed. For 24 months at 0%, the monthly payment was $1,512.50. Dale ran that number in his head on the drive home. Tight. Doable. He told himself doable. Sandra made pot roast that night. Dale told her the payment amount and she was quiet a long moment. And after 24 months, he told her it would adjust. Adjust to what? He said prime plus 2.5. She asked what prime was running. He said around 11%, give or take, but it had been coming down. She said so the rate could be 13.5%. He said that was the ceiling, not the floor. She didn't argue. She put the roast on the table and let it go. That spring, the 4650 worked the way a new machine is supposed to work. It was quieter than anything Dale had ever sat in. The cab sealed out the dust, the radio worked, and it pulled his field cultivator at a pace that made his old rows look like they were afraid to keep up. He covered ground he used to cover in 5 days and 3. Bud Stasek drove by in April, saw the green machine turning rows across the east field and honked twice. Dale raised 2 fingers off the steering wheel. That was as close to gloating as he ever got. Through the summer of 1983, the payments hit like clockwork. $1,500 and change every month out of the operating account. The corn planted well. Prices were soft, around $3.20 a bushel through the summer, but nothing alarming. The tractor didn't break. The cab held heat. The hydraulics ran clean. For 6 months, 0% wasn't zero risk. It was just 0%. Everything felt the way the sign promised. Then came fall. Corn came in at 148 bushels per acre, decent yield for the ground Dale farmed. He sold in November at $3.10. The math worked out if he didn't think too hard. He made his land payment, his operating note, his equipment payment. Sandra paid the propane bill and put $40 into the Christmas account. They weren't suffering, but there was nothing left over. There was never anything left over anymore. Dale had made 9 payments by February 1984. The tractor had performed. Nobody could argue with that. But that month he sat down with the financing contract for the first time since he'd signed it. really sat down with it at the kitchen table, under the overhead light, with a notepad and a pen. Sandra was doing the bills at the other end of the table, and neither of them spoke for a long time. The contract was 11 pages. The rate adjustment clause was on page 7. He read it once, he read it again. The language said the rate would adjust to prime rate as published by the Federal Reserve on the first business day of the month following the 24th payment, plus 250 basis points with no cap. No cap. He put the pen down. No ceiling on what the rate could become. That wasn't what Phil had implied. Or maybe it was. Dale tried to remember the exact words. Adjust to prime plus 2.5. That's what Phil had said. That was technically correct. Dale had heard it as a known number. It wasn't a known number. It was a formula tied to something Dale didn't control. He also found the balloon clause on page 9. If he chose not to refinance at the rate adjustment date, the full remaining principal, whatever balance was left after the 24 payments, was due within 60 days. He looked at that number. After 24 months of payments at zero interest, he would still owe exactly $36,300 minus 24 months of principal, which on a zero interest structure meant 24 times $1,512.50 applied entirely to principal, so $36,300 minus $36,300. He stopped. That couldn't be right. He went back to page 3, the amortization schedule. The 24-month 0% period was structured as interest only, not principal reduction. Interest only at a 0% rate, which meant the payments covered nothing but the principal portion of a flat payment schedule. But across 24 months, only $36,300 would be reduced by $36,300. He traced his finger across the table. No, wait. The payment was $1,512, 50 times 24 months, which was $36,300. So after 24 months, the balance would be zero? He did it again on the notepad. $36,300 divided by 24 equals $1,512.50. Yes. After 24 payments, the principal balance was zero, so there was no balloon. He exhaled. Sandra looked up. He shook his head, said, "Never mind," and put the contract in the drawer. He hadn't read it carefully enough. The amortization schedule showed only the first 24 months. What he hadn't looked at, what he didn't look at until he pulled the contract back out at 11 o'clock that night, because something still felt wrong, was the small table at the bottom of page 5. The one that showed the post-teaser amortization. The one that said the 24-month teaser period covered only a portion of the principal, specifically $36,300, multiplied by a prorated percentage based on the full loan term of 84 months. The actual loan was a 7-year note. The 0% teaser covered months 1 through 24. Months 25 through 84 would be re-amortized on the remaining balance. He did the math slowly. 7-year amortization at 0% for 2 years meant the 0% period had reduced principal based on a 7-year schedule, not a 2-year payoff. The actual principal paid down in 24 flat payments of $1,512.50 when re-amortized across 84 months was approximately $9,100, not $36,300. After 24 months, he would still owe roughly $27,200. That $27,200 would then re-amortize over 60 months at prime plus 2.5. He wrote prime at 11% on the notepad. 11 plus 2.5 was 13.5%. $27,200 over 60 months at 13.5% came out to a monthly payment of approximately $620. He wrote it down. Then he wrote down prime at 12, 14.5%, 60 months, $635 per month. He wrote prime at 13, 15.5, $650. Then he wrote what it was as of February 1984. Prime was at 11.5. The rate would be 14%. His new monthly payment starting in month 25 would be $627. He stared at it. His current payment was $1,512.50. The new payment was $627. That looked like relief. For a moment, one full minute, he thought he'd been worried about nothing. Then he looked at what he'd actually been paying versus what the tractor had cost him. He'd put $5,000 down. He'd paid $1,512.50 per month for the first 24 months. That was $36,300 in payments, plus the $5,000 down. He'd already paid $41,300 toward a $47,500 machine, and he still owed $27,200. The math didn't add up until he understood that the 0% period had functioned like a disguised prepayment schedule. He'd retired a large share of principal fast, at no interest. That part was genuinely good. But the remaining balance was real, and the rate on it was not zero. 0% wasn't zero risk. The math just hit it for 2 years. He put the notepad in the drawer next to the contract and went to bed. He didn't sleep. By spring of 1984, he'd done the calculation enough times to feel settled about the new payment amount. $627 per month was manageable. Corn was at $3.30. His yields had been solid. He told himself that if rates came down and the Fed had been signaling downward pressure, the payment could actually drop below $600. He told himself the tractor had earned its keep. Both things were true enough to be comfortable. What changed wasn't the contract, it was everything around it. Through late 1984 and into 1985, land values in central Illinois began their slow collapse. Property that had sold for $2,800 an acre in 1981 was sitting on the market at $1,400. Some farms in the county weren't moving at any price. Dale's 560 acres had been informally appraised at $1.1 million the prior year. By the fall of 1984, his lender, Midwest Production Credit Association, sent a letter noting that collateral reassessment reviews were being scheduled for all large operating notes in their portfolio. It was a form letter. It had his name on it. His operating note was $185,000 secured against the land. At $1,100 per acre, the land was worth $616,000. That was a healthy margin. At $1,400 per acre, the number now being whispered at the co-op, that margin was still adequate. But lenders weren't whispering anymore. They were using the word tightening. They were using the phrase collateral review. Dale had heard those words before. He'd heard them at auction previews and estate sales. They were the words that came before a lien. He went back to the kitchen table with a different kind of notebook. Collateral isn't free. The land secures the operating note. The tractor is listed as secondary collateral on the equipment note through the dealer's finance arm. If the tractor depreciates below the remaining note balance, the finance company has the right, on page 8, paragraph 4, to request additional collateral or immediate refinancing. He'd read that clause in February. He'd understood it less than he thought. The tractor was 30 months old. He called a used equipment dealer in Champaign and asked what a used 4650 with 1,400 hours was moving for. The man said $28,000 to $31,000 depending on condition. Dale wrote $29,000 at the midpoint. His remaining note balance was approximately $24,800 by that point. He'd made 8 payments at the new rate, and principal was coming down, so the tractor was still worth more than he owed. But the gap was closing. Equipment depreciates, interest compounds. The direction of travel on both is the same. In the spring of 1985, he drove out to the Phillips farm 7 miles east. Lyle Phillips had bought a new grain cart and a planter upgrade in 1982 on similar teaser terms. His balloon had come due in November 1984. He hadn't been able to refinance, the bank had pulled back on operating credit, land values had dropped, and his equipment had depreciated below the note balance. The finance company had sent a truck for the grain cart. Lyle was farming with what he had left and trying not to talk about it. His wife had gone back to work at the school district. Dale came home from that visit and sat in the cab of his 4650 for about 15 minutes without starting it. He hadn't missed a payment. The tractor worked. His yields were holding. Prime had come down a half point since the adjustment, so his payment was $613 now instead of $627. By every surface measure, he was fine. But at the coffee counter at Hurr's Hardware on a Tuesday morning in April, he mentioned to no one in particular that he was thinking about selling the 4650 and going back to an older machine. The hardware store went quiet the way hardware stores do when a man says something everyone thinks is stupid. Bud Stasek didn't even look up from his mug. "You're gonna sell a machine that runs perfect and go back to a broke-down relic." It wasn't a question. Dale said he was thinking about reducing his exposure. Bud said that was the dumbest thing he'd heard since Marvin Deutsch tried to plant Milo in a drought year. Someone else laughed. Someone said that was Dale's business. The silence after that was the kind that has opinions in it. Dale paid for his coffee and left. Here's what he knew and what was hard to explain over coffee. The tractor was not the problem in isolation. The tractor was the problem in combination. He still owed $24,800 on a machine depreciating toward $26,000 at best, toward $22,000 if the equipment market softened with land. His operating note was under collateral review at land values that were still falling. If the bank tightened his operating credit and he had a bad yield year, say corn dropped to $2.80 and he came in at 130 bushels instead of 148, his cash position at harvest would be around $78,000. Gross on 230 acres of corn. Expenses, land payment, operating note service, and the equipment note would total approximately $81,400. He'd be short by $3,400 before he paid himself anything. In that scenario, not a catastrophe scenario, just a bad year, the lender had the right to review secondary collateral, which meant the lender could put a lien inquiry on his land. He would not pledge his land for a tractor. He listed the 4650 in late May 1985 through an equipment broker in Peoria. He got $27,500. His payoff on the note at that point was $23,100. After the broker's fee and transaction costs, he netted $3,600 over what he owed. He paid off the note. He called his cousin Harold in Indiana, who had a 1976 John Deere 4430 he'd been trying to sell for 2 years. Dale bought it for $9,500 cash. It had a decent cab, good hydraulics, and needed a new seat cushion and a thermostat. He drove it home in June. It was slower than the 4650 by 20%. It did not have a working radio. The joke started immediately. Bud Stasek drove by during first cultivation and honked once, long like a question. At the elevator in July, a man Dale didn't know well said he'd heard Dale had sold his good tractor and gone backward. Dale said he'd sold a finance tractor and bought a paid tractor. The man looked at him the way people look at someone who's said something technically correct and entirely beside the point. That fall, corn came in at 131 bushels per acre. Price at harvest was $2.94. It was the bad year Dale had modeled in the kitchen. His gross on corn was $76,500. His expense column, with no equipment note and a paid tractor, came to $71,200, including the land payment and full operating note service. He was short nothing. He had $5,300 left over. He put it against the operating note principal. His lender sent no review letters that winter. 3 miles north of his driveway, the Becker farm went into foreclosure in October 1985. Gary Becker had 2 financed equipment notes and an operating line that had been pulled by the bank in August. His balloon on a 1982 planter package had come due and he couldn't refinance. The land went to the lender. Becker moved to Peoria. His wife's family had a house there. By spring 1986, the dealer lots in the county looked different. There were more used machines and fewer new ones. Some lots had repos lined up along the fence in various states of condition. Tractors with hour meters under 1,000, planters with 1 season on them, combines that smelled like new rubber still. equipment that had been somebody's upgrade 2 years ago. Phil Etten called Dale once that spring, mentioned a deal on a new machine, said the financing terms were excellent. Dale thanked him and said he was fine. Phil said to call if anything changed. Dale said he would. Neither of them brought up the 4650. He still owns the 4430. It has pushed past 6,200 hours and needed a full hydraulic rebuild in 1991 and a head job in 1998, both of which Dale or his son handled in the shop. It runs, it works, it has never had a lien on it. The 4650 that sat in his field for 2.5 years, the one with the 0% sign and the heated cab and the radio, cost him $41,300 in payments, $5,000 down, a trade-in he undervalued, and 2.5 years of collateral exposure during the worst credit environment in American agriculture since the Depression. When he sold it, he walked away with $3,600 net above payoff. He counts that as a loss dressed up as a break-even. He reads it the way a man reads a near miss. Not a disaster, not a miracle, just a calculation he almost got wrong. Here's what actually happened in that contract. 0% was real for 24 months on a 7-year note that left $27,000 outstanding when the teaser ended. The balloon risk wasn't a scam, and it was a structure. The rate adjustment wasn't hidden. It was on page 7 in standard type. The collateral clause wasn't unusual. Every commercial equipment note has one. None of it was fraud. All of it was legal. And all of it could have taken his farm if corn had dropped another 30 cents, and his lender had called a review in the same quarter his equipment went underwater. 0% wasn't zero risk. The fine print was in the fine print. He just had to read it. If you've ever signed a financing agreement and stopped at the monthly payment number, and most of us have, this story is worth sitting with. Would you have pledged farmland as collateral for equipment? Would you have trusted a promotional rate without reading the adjustment formula? Drop your answer in the comments. The people who got caught in 1985 weren't stupid. They were busy and the terms looked fine from a distance. If this kind of story is useful to you, real decisions, real numbers, real consequences without the Hollywood ending, hit subscribe. There are more of them. The farm crisis had thousands of variations on this exact story, and most of them are still being settled in county courthouses and estate paperwork 40 years later. Dale kept his farm. He lost money on the tractor. He still thinks he made the right call. He's probably right. But he'll also tell you he made it later than he should have, with more information than he'd had at signing, and with less margin for error than he'd understood in March of 1983. That's not a hero's story. That's just an honest one.